Okay, welcome. I am Andrea Hill, and I'm your host for this MJSA webinar on mapping your business, how to identify value gaps and potential economic exposure to ensure a strong return to business. Of course, business mapping is something that has long been an important part of running an effective business. And a couple of weeks ago, doing another one of these MJSA webinars, I was talking about global supply chains, and I mentioned just in passing mapping your supply chain. And so many questions came out of that we decided to do a whole webinar on business process mapping. This is part of the MJSA webinar series. MJSA has been producing these for 2 years now. We're typically on an every third Thursday schedule, but during the COVID crisis, we decided to bump it up to every week to provide as much value as we can to the jewelry industry while people are figuring out, what to do and how to do it in this new next that we're in. I am Andrea Hill. I'm your host for the series. I own Hill Management Group, and we consult the entire jewelry vertical worldwide from mine to market through our Works brands. So without any further commentary, I'm going to just switch over to our slides and then get started. I will be doing questions and answers at the end of this. Please, when you think of questions, go ahead and post them in that chat box. That way you don't forget what you were going to ask, and I can look for it later. And if I can, I will try to catch some of those questions in line as we go. Okay, so let's get started. We're talking about mapping your business. Your business is a collection of processes. I know we don't tend to think about businesses that way, but that's what they are. So selling, marketing, making things, accounting, purchasing, hiring help, then training that help, all of these things are accomplished by a collection of processes. And when things go wrong in a business, it is almost always due to bad process. I've spent my entire career going into businesses that need fixing, and every single time I start by analyzing the processes. I start by asking people how they do their processes. I will ask 5 people doing the same job to tell me how they do their processes, but I ask them independently. I don't put them in the same room and say, all of you tell me how you do your process. I like to hear how each person does that process that they're supposedly doing like everybody else. And then I compare my notes to see if they do their processes differently, and even if they understand their processes differently. So your business, and every single business, I don't care if you are a one-person business or if you're a large corporation with a couple hundred employees, your business is a collection of processes. And when things go wrong, it's because a process is broken. So of all the options listed here on this slide, investing in some new big equipment, buying a building or a larger building, or changing the way you do things, what do you think is the most risky? I won't make you go in the chat box and expose yourself with an answer. It's changing the way you do things. So why is that one the most risky of these 3 things? And remember, we're talking about change right now because everything is changing. We are changing the way we work. We're changing the way we enter our workspaces. We're changing the way we communicate with our customers and manage our supply chains. It's all changing. So why is changing the way you do things the most risky? It's because when you buy a piece of equipment or you buy a piece of real estate, it's pretty easy to work out the ROI. The return on investment for those kinds of things or the formula for return on investment for those kinds of things is pretty easy. But when you change the way you do things, there are a lot of hidden details that can go unnoticed until the damage has been done, and sometimes till long after the damage has been done. I just told you a moment ago that I've made a specialty out of going in and fixing broken businesses by looking at the processes. In every single case, there are examples of deep, hidden process problems that are at the heart of the business's damage. And sometimes those hidden problems are so insidious that they're really hard to find. So some of the examples of that would be Well, the first problem here is an example of an insufficiently defined process. So, a company that had a product development process, they were coming up with new products, in this particular case, chemistries for manufacturing, but they didn't have defined steps for customer testing. So, sometimes they tested with customers, sometimes they didn't. During the times they tested with customers, they tested in different ways each time. There was no defined process, so they ended up with this really um, uh, spotty quality record on new product launches. And they'd launch a new product, and it would take 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 months before the product stabilized. And by then they'd upset a lot of customers. So, but the core of that problem was that they didn't have a sufficiently defined process for testing in the product development phase. The second example is an example of a business process that was derailed by a suboptimizing metric. That's a process problem. So in this case, they were promoting themselves as a company that did great customer service. We're here for you. We love you. But they were measuring the people on the phones. Okay, this was like the late 1990s. So the people that were answering all those phone calls, they were measuring them on how quickly they got customers off the phone. So if people are being measured by how fast they move the customers along, they're not necessarily giving the best service. So their process problem was a suboptimizing metric. And then the third problem that's on this slide is an example of organizational silos and the failure to identify that your internal customers need things from you. So in that case, manufacturing kept having quality problems, couldn't understand why. Finally, when we dug into the process, there was no connection in the processes between manufacturing and purchasing. So purchasing had actually changed some of the raw materials to get the prices down, not understanding how that affected the ultimate manufacturing quality. So these are some examples of the kinds of hidden problems that you find when you go and analyze companies' processes. In fact, you can avoid as much as 75% of business problems by doing process mapping. So, and it's not the map that fixes it, it's the learning to think in the way that process maps teach you to think. So this is a thinking process made graphic, made visual. Now, process mapping can be super fun, both at work and for personal projects and expression. I know that a lot of people think this is a super nerdy topic, like who wants to spend an hour talking about mapping? I love process mapping. It's accessible to everyone, and you can use it for so many things. You can use process mapping to help you solve problems and make decisions. Many business owners, particularly small business owners that are ultra worried for good reason about cash flow or the impact of a decision that you make, when you don't have any buffer to support you if a decision is bad, the tendency is to get frozen and not make a decision at all. A process map can actually help you map out your thought process to make better decisions and not get frozen, because not making decisions can be just as business damaging as making the wrong business decisions. So process maps can be used for that. They can be used to train people. So when you bring somebody new into your business and you want them to learn how to do a particular activity, and whether they're temporary or part-time or full-time, process maps can make the learning process for your people so much easier, which is a huge service to them and ultimately a benefit to the company. You can also use, as I said before, the process maps to find process problems. So can you see what's wrong with this process? This is an actual process map from a client. When I got there, I was so excited. They had process maps. I was impressed. And I spent my first day just reviewing their process maps. Now, by the way, nobody has a bunch of perfect processes. If somebody comes in and analyzes my company's process maps, and we have a process map for everything, they're going to find some errors. So this is not a criticism of that. But I spent my first day just analyzing their process maps. And then I asked a bunch of questions. And one question that I asked was, do you have slowdowns in your receiving department? Do your buyers complain that the products make it to your warehouse, but then it takes forever for them to get into stock, that they're not moving through receiving fast enough? And of course, they thought I was brilliant, like magic. Oh, yes, we have that problem. How did you know that? Well, I knew that because right here in this process map, they didn't have any process steps for telling people what to do if the product they received had a quality problem, or if the number of items they received were too few, or if they received the wrong item entirely. Now, people use logic to solve those problems. It's not like they didn't solve those problems, but the receivers all handled it in different ways because there wasn't a defined process for it. Some of those ways were more effective than others. Some people, not knowing what to do, would just shove the box off to the side and say, I'll deal with it later. You probably have an email folder like that, the I'll deal with it later email folder. And of course, the things we put to the side to deal with later, they get forgotten. So I knew they had problems in getting their inventory from dock door to shelf because they didn't have process steps telling people what to do when things go wrong. So you can use process mapping to find process problems. In fact, you can use mapping to do a lot of things. So you can find and fix hidden problems. You can make your supply chain more transparent. You can make it more resilient. You can alter your strategy. Right now, we're all thinking about who am I as a business going forward. Process mapping can help you work through that question. You can use it to identify new service and product offerings, to automate anything. When we go in and do systems integration to implement big Industry 4.0 integrations in large manufacturing plants, we do process maps for everything first. But when we set up a drip campaign for a small company that's just doing some marketing automation, we do process maps for that too. You can use a process map to automate anything and should use a process map first. You can use process maps to improve your sales and to bump up your marketing performance. So these are all things you can use process maps for. You can also use process maps to dream up new ways of working and then run scenarios on those ideas to see how they might turn out. Because when you change anything in your business, you take some risk. Sure, it might work, and it might mostly work, but it might also not work, or it might mostly work but have some problem that causes you issues with customers that you can't even see until later when the problem has ballooned. So how do you know if you're making the right choice? How do you know if you have the right plan? Well, there's no 100% guarantee, of course, but one thing will certainly help, and that's mapping your ideas before you implement them. Process mapping takes a lot of the guesswork out of change, and it helps you better forecast the outcomes of your decisions. And who doesn't want a bit of reassurance when um, making new business decisions? So how do you process map? Well, this is how you process map. It's really simple. But when I show you this, it kind of looks like word salad, right? It's like a whole bunch of bullet points, and I don't know what to do with that. When I show you the exact same set of words like this, by making it visual, I've made it more accessible to most people because we have, in general, people have less mental resistance to graphics than we do to sentences and paragraphs. So presenting the information graphically makes it more accessible, easier to abstract because we're not resisting it. It also makes the relationship between the steps clearer. Um, it just makes it easier to understand exactly what's supposed to happen. So this is a process map about how to process map. I love this diagram on so many levels. It can be used as a training tool on how to process map. It can be used as an explanation for what process mapping is. It's easy to understand and it's easy to abstract. So now that you've stared at it, you know how to process map. I guess we're done. Okay, we're not done. So if you have to choose between this and this, clearly the process map tells a more compelling story. So since we're not really done, and it's only a few minutes into this session, let's just start talking about some of the nuance of process mapping, and then I'm going to show you some examples of how to do process mapping in a couple of major areas that people are concerned about. One is supply chains, and one is marketing. But as I said, you can apply it everywhere. You start with creating an initial diagram, and you want to do this really fast and very simply and just give a general overview of any given process that you want to map. And by the way, you don't ever start by process mapping your whole business. Even as a tiny business, you don't have a big piece of paper big enough for that. You don't have a table big enough for that. So what you do is you break down your business into discrete chunks, and it may be internal things like how you do things, and it may be external things like who you work with in your supply chain, or how you interact with your customers. So you just start with you break your whole business down into all the different sections that you're going to map, and you don't try to get it all done today because that's overwhelming. You just focus on key things, and over time you build maps around your whole business. So make the first one fast. It's like writing. Write first, get the whole thought out there, and then edit. That's how we do process mapping. Have you ever handed a process off to someone? So somebody came in to help you in your business. It's an employee or it's a contractor or whatever. Somebody comes in to help you and you train them. And they get it. They're bright. You think they're getting it. They think they're getting it. And then later you realize the process isn't working anymore, or something has gone wrong and you're not even sure where. Well, a great way to find out what broke and where is to ask that person to do this simple process map and show you what they're doing. Nearly all the time, you'll be able to see what's missing or being done incorrectly in the process. In fact, most business mistakes are due to process problems. And this is why I preach this concept all the time. First, you solve the process, then you solve the people. Many times we think an employee or a contractor or a vendor is not caring about the process, or not smart enough, or stubborn, or we tend to think people are being defective when in fact they're often working with defective processes. Most of the time they're working with defective processes, and processes are really easy to solve when you break them down. Even if it's a big problem, once you understand it, you can figure out how to solve it. But being frustrated with a person or a team of people for doing something wrong, that's harder to fix, because you look at the people as people and you're like, these are nice people. I like these people. They mean well. Why are they screwing up? Well, they're not defective. Almost all the time it's the process. So first you solve the process, then you solve the people. Now you can start with that little, circles and arrows diagram, but many people prefer to start with something like a mind map. So for some people, the very first step is to just mind map it. I'm assuming you guys are familiar with mind maps. Just jump in the chat box and let me know. Give me a yes or a no about familiarity with mind maps. These are just, there are lots of different styles of mapping. They're all valid. Okay, so we've got some no's and some yeses. So a mind map is a way of taking your thought process and getting it on paper very quickly. And especially working within the design community, I have seen some absolutely glorious mind maps, things that I want to frame and hang on the wall. So you start with a central idea. In this case, it's, okay, so I'm going to teach somebody about mind mapping. Well, what do I want to talk about mind mapping? I might want to talk about all the places I can use it. So I can use it for planning projects. And so I put planning as one pole. And I can use it to be more creative. So I make creative another one of the legs that comes out of it. Well, I can use it to be more productive. So I use productivity as one of my legs coming out of the main idea. I can use it to collaborate. It gives me benefits. So once I come up with my main ideas, then I take each main idea and I branch it off again. We often use this for project planning. So we'll take a mind map and we'll say, okay, so what's the project? It's to have a new selling strategy done by such and such a date. Okay, so then we start with selling strategy in the middle. Well, what are selling strategies about? Well, it's about the product, so I put products as one pole. It's about targeting certain customer groups, so customer targeting is another leg. It's about, and I'm doing this mind map as I tell it to you because I didn't pre-think this one. It's about the tools we use for selling. Okay, so that's one pole. Oh, it's about the tools we use for marketing, because marketing must support selling, so that's another pole. So I come up with all my main ideas and then I say, okay, what am I going to think about in terms of products? Am I going to have some new products? So I'm on my product leg now, new products. I can use some new products, but I should also carry forward some existing products. Do I need to do some product innovation, something really different because people are buying differently now? Maybe we feel differently about the world than we did 3 months ago. So maybe I need some products that address the current zeitgeist. So once I think of all my, what about the zeitgeist? Oh, I can go out on that leg and I can say, well, what is the zeitgeist? Well, people are staying in, but they're on Zoom meetings, so we're doing a lot of video. So you just take each idea and you pull those threads until you have this big spidery looking map of ideas. Sometimes the best place to do your product process mapping is to start with the mind map. And then once all the ideas are on the page, you then start organizing them in a process map. So mind maps are about blah, cast the wide net, get all the ideas out there. Process maps are about organizing the content. So your initial diagram, whether you do it as a quick and dirty circles and arrows or whether you do it as a mind map, almost always you're going to discover you need additional information after you're done creating that first one. That's what I mean by start fast and then edit. Now you're heading towards your editing phase. So it may mean that you need more information about the people that are involved in each step, or you may need, and by the way, those people could be your customers. I've invited customers to participate in process maps more often than I can tell you. It could be your vendors, could be your coworkers, your employees. It could be some people that you trust that aren't necessarily working in your business, but you know will give you a different perspective. So you're gathering information, and then you're looking to this group of people to answer these questions. So what's the overall goal of this process that we're mapping? What triggers the start of the process? So when somebody, what triggers the start of the purchasing process? Well, somebody needs something. How do I know somebody needs something? Well, it could be somebody places an order for something I don't have in stock. So now I have a back order. Could be a request directly to a salesperson from a customer. It could be going out in your stock area and looking and seeing you have an empty bin if you're doing a Kanban type of inventory environment. But something triggers the start of your process. Also, what signals the end of your process? Remember, we're trying to gate these processes because you don't have the table big enough to map your whole business. Real quick question, because it's appropriate in line. Ani's saying, I've heard about mind mapping, but I've never done this, and I'm not sure how much time it takes and the dedication needed. I'll say this again in the session. Thinking is hard work. So things we can do to make the thinking more fun and more accessible are hugely valuable. The answer to your question, how much time does it take and how much dedication does it take? It takes all the dedication. Whether you spend 2 minutes on it or 25 minutes on it or 7 hours on it, it gets your focus for that amount of time. But as far as how much time it takes, I've seen brilliant mind maps produced in a couple of minutes and other brilliant mind maps produced in several hours. So it really just depends on the scope of what you're trying to do. But you're using it as a tool to focus your thinking. Okay, so back to gating. So what triggers the start of the process? What signals the end of the process? What are the activities in each step and who's involved in each one? And are there any alternative routes in the process? And those are these yes, no, if, then paths that you'll see come up in some of our examples. So this is the information that you're collecting once you've done your first quick and dirty process map. Now, even if you are the only person working on a process, being specific will always make your maps better. And certainly when you're working with one other or a whole group of people, make sure you use very specific terminology. Ask questions of participants or ask questions of yourself and refuse to settle for anything that's ambiguous. Have you ever had an argument with a spouse or a friend and you're arguing and you realize suddenly that you think you're talking about the same thing, but you're not? It's a really common relationship issue. Well, it's usually because we're using one word, but we're using it in two different ways. So this will make your whole life better, in business and personally, if you never use one word to mean two different things. So always ask questions about what words mean. What's a file? Is a file a folder? Is a file a document? Is it paper? Is it digital? If somebody refers to a file in a process, clarify what that is and make sure you know the whole list of what that is. What does it mean to send something? Am I mailing it? Am I emailing it? Am I sending it out through a digital file server like Hightail? Am I just sending a link to something that's in Google Drive? The word send can mean a lot of different things. So when you're producing your process maps, you will see there are a lot of words that can be used in more than one way. You need to get so specific that you understand what each of those words means. And again, that's whether you're doing the map by yourself or with someone else. Once you've gathered all of that, so you've done your quick and dirty map, and then you've gone and asked all those questions about what triggers the start of it, what's the end of it, who's involved in it, what do the words mean. Then you're going to incorporate all of that new information into your diagram by fleshing out each step. Don't make assumptions on even little things such as the format of a date field. A diagram is useless unless it's really detailed and correct and comprehensive. So this is where you have to be very disciplined about picking through every single detail. And then show this diagram to everybody who was involved in the process map and elicit their responses. Ask them, do you see anything wrong with it? What am I missing? And you keep doing that until you're sure that everyone's satisfied with the finalized process. And it's really important to keep the goal of the process in mind all the time. So if the goal of purchasing raw materials is to produce quality manufactured goods, well, don't let that word quality fall out. If somebody starts thinking, oh, the goal of purchasing raw materials is to produce manufactured goods, then they make mistakes like that one I referenced earlier where they were so focused on getting the price down that they threw the quality out. So you have to stay focused on the true purpose of every process and define that at the outset so that when you're doing your process work, you keep the most important elements in. So your diagram or your process map is complete when you've shown a process that achieves the goal and everybody thinks it's clear. That's what you're working for. So that's how you process map. And I'll show you lots of other process maps in a few minutes, but really they're just a series of a step and an arrow and a step and an arrow. If yes, go this way. If no, go that way. It's extremely logical. So I want to stop for just a minute now and review the reasons and benefits, and then we'll dig back into the process map. So process mapping makes it possible to look at the big picture in a way that some people tend to focus on the micro, some people tend to focus on the macro. We need both, and either one without the other is not sufficient for running a business. So I have a tendency to be super macro focused. So I always make sure there are people in my close circle who will drag me to the micro and make sure that I see that too. Likewise, if you are very micro in your focus, you need macro people around you. Some people, everybody lives somewhere on that spectrum. Nobody is, we're not just all either macro or micro, but process mapping makes it possible to look at the big picture, particularly for people who are micro in focus or more micro. It also makes it easy to imagine multiple scenarios when you're trying to think of something new to do. So if you're thinking about that new way of selling, if you're thinking about launching a new retail space, if you're thinking about bringing in a new subcontractor or a new vendor, process mapping can help you think through all of the possible conclusions of those decisions and the permutations of that. So process mapping is great for that. It helps you see how your processes can be changed or improved. The visualness, is that a word? The visualness of process maps helps you spot problems, like that example I showed you before when there were missing process steps. It keeps everyone on the same page. If you're working with a team of people, that process map helps you ensure that everybody's doing the same things in the same way. And if you need to change a process, everybody has to go through the process map and agree on it. Nobody gets to go off and just change the process experimentally without the group all agreeing. So that keeps your processes very consistent, which keeps your quality high. It helps you reduce errors, therefore. It also helps you prevent unnecessary changes and corrections in the future. So, that example that I gave you where a company didn't have a step modeled into their product development for testing with customers during the product development phase, it meant that they'd launch the product prematurely and then change and change and change and change and change again until they got it right. That's expensive and it really upsets customers. And it also helps you forecast and visualize scenarios. So I think I'm being slightly redundant there. So these are the reasons and benefits for doing process mapping. And again, what I said before, thinking is hard work. And we have a tendency to resist it because tactical things are more gratifying. I can quick answer some email, I can quick file something away, I can quick make something. But when we stop to think, most of us feel a little bit of resistance before we just dig in and give in to the process. So, process mapping provides structure to your thinking, it makes concepts tangible and visible, and it is fun. And I really think fun should be a premium at work. So, this is one of the reasons I like process mapping so much. So now we've talked about what process mapping is, how you get started. It's such a simple thing. Don't overcomplicate what the process map itself is. It's just a series of logical steps that connect to one another in order. That's all it is. So the real excitement about process mapping is how you can apply it. So we're going to start with supply chain mapping because, as I told you, I did that webinar on globalization and the impact of COVID-19 on global supply chains. And I mentioned supply chain mapping, and I didn't even realize I said it. And then later there were all these questions. So we're going to start with this. So supply chain maps are for managing risk in the supply chain and for creating more responsibility and potentially transparency in the supply chain. There are a lot of good reasons to do supply chain mapping. Supply chains get disrupted. Now we know COVID-19 has been a massive supply chain disruption, but the first time I ever did a supply chain map would have been in the I want to say late 1980s. I was running a clothing manufacturing business, and a competitor had a terrible fire in a sewing operation on the African continent, and we panicked saying, oh my God, what do we even know who's deep in our supply chain? Like, what if this happened to people that were working on our clothing? And so we started quickly figuring out who was in our supply chain. We knew the pieces close to us. We didn't know the pieces further out from us. So fire and explosions can cause supply chain disruptions. The tariffs that were from the U.S. tariffs against China in 2019 caused supply chain disruptions all the way through 2019, even before COVID-19. Storms and floods and natural disasters can cause supply chain disruptions. If a manufacturer has a major machinery problem, you might not get your order on time. You could upset a lot of customers. I mean, this whole list is the stuff that causes supply chain disruption. And if you want to be able to run your business effectively, you need to be aware of what the risks are and have plans for mitigating those risks as much as possible. So this is the main reason that companies do supply chain mapping. So there's a starting point. Your starting point for supply chain mapping actually sort of depends on your intention. If you're just working on more resilient supply chains, then you're going to be thinking a lot about one set of goals. If you're thinking about more responsible supply chains, you're going to be thinking about another set of goals. Of course, I would encourage you to think about both sets of goals, but from a mapping perspective, the maps look a little different. So the starting point for a more resilient supply chain would be thinking about, first of all, who all your suppliers are. And you want to think about that from both a cost and a revenue point of view. So you might have one supplier that you don't spend very much money with, but what you get from them is absolutely key to the specialness of the thing you sell. So it may not be the suppliers that you spend the most money with, but you need to think about which suppliers you depend on, which locations could be impacted by a disruption. So it could be your operations, could be your suppliers' operations. You want to think about the arcs between your suppliers, which is like, how do you ship from one supply point to another supply point? Does all the material come directly to you, or does some of that material have to get bounced around to aggregators or to a subcontractor or to a manufacturing point before it comes to you? So you're thinking about all of these relationships between your suppliers, because in most cases, even with very simple supply chains, and the jewelry industry's supply chains are fairly simple compared to a lot of industries, but there are links between all these points in the supply chain. So you want to think about that and the dependencies, which materials need to get to which manufacturers or which subcontractors and which ones come straight to me. And then you want to think about what kind of measures you could put in place to quickly become aware of supply chain disruptions. Um, for jewelry manufacturers that had all of their manufacturing in China when COVID-19 hit, they were shut down hard. But there were some jewelry manufacturers that had some manufacturing in China, some in Thailand, some still here in the United States, some in Mexico. And it was really interesting to watch this. We've tried to get jewelry manufacturers to be more resilient for many years now, ever since they started offshoring everything to China and India. Some would say that having manufacturing in all of those different locations was overkill. But during COVID-19, as the crisis started in China, then rolled over to Europe, and then has slowly rolled to the rest of the world, having manufacturing operations in all those different places has allowed those companies to stay in business. So, thinking about what measures you could put in place to protect your business in case of disruption is a very important part of the starting point for mapping for resilience. Now, if you're mapping for responsibility, you're going to think about a different set of criteria. It's not completely different, it's a Venn diagram. So there's a lot of the stuff in the resilient supply chain planning that works for the responsible and vice versa. And for people who are focused on both, again, which I encourage you to do, the crossover is huge. But because the maps can look slightly different, I want you to be aware that there are some differences. Now, before I talk about mapping for responsibility, I want to make something really clear. It's that situation where people tend to use one word and they use it in lots of ways. So the words transparency and responsibility are areas that people are using those words in different ways, and we don't have clarity in the space yet. So when I talk about responsible supply chain mapping, I'm talking about the discovery process, which is one of the first steps to both traceability and transparency. So creating a supply chain map is not the same thing as making a supply chain transparent. So think about it this way: mapping equals discovery. So supply chain mapping is the process of engaging with direct suppliers to discover indirect suppliers, which results in an understanding of your end-to-end supply chain from for a material or a product or a brand. And it's usually the only time, for many companies, it's the first time that they get in direct contact with all of their indirect suppliers. So it's a really good time to collect data on quality control and social and environmental performance and make sure that this indirect supply chain lives up to the brand standards. Supply chain mapping is then the foundation for risk planning. It's the foundation for traceability. It's the foundation for transparency. If you don't do the discovery, you can't do the other two pieces. So traceability, what's that? Traceability is about assurance. So many companies are really eager to publish their supply chains once they're mapped. But remember that supply chain mapping is only part of this equation. It's just the supplier disclosure piece. So supply chain traceability is the process of tracking every commercial interaction or transaction in the end-to-end supply chain to account for the time and the place where every step occurred in the supply chain. It's important to get supply chains mapped now, because not only does traceability offer a lot of advantages, from real-time, for instance, chain of custody reports, or to verification that products are authentic and vendors are certified, but it's also becoming a consumer expectation and a legal expectation in many industries. So mapping sets the stage for traceability, even if we don't have all the traceability tools in place yet. And then finally, transparency is about disclosure. So once you map your supply chain, if you share the results with your stakeholders, you are creating transparency. It may not have assurance, but it is transparent. You can even share your transparency and say, hey, this is an area that I have zero visibility to. I can tell you answers about these parts of my supply chain, but I can't tell you answers about those parts of my supply chain. That is, in fact, transparent behavior, even if you don't have all the answers yet or the assurance. So I just really wanted to lay out the difference between mapping, which is discovery, and traceability, which is assurance, and transparency, which is disclosure, either full or could be certified partial, whatever, but sharing that information, because I don't want you to think that mapping your supply chain makes you transparent or makes you assured. Okay, so now let's take a look at how you would map. Now we're going to go back to a slide from 2 slides ago. That's starting point for resilience. Let's look at mapping a resilient supply chain. Look at the legend on the left of this slide. Critical raw materials are a dark blue. Multi-supplier raw materials are a light blue. Okay, so this is just me telling the difference between what I really have to make something and what I can kind of move around to make something. Then dark red is critical subcontractors, and light red is multi-supplier subcontractors. So again, the dark red ones are the ones I need them working. I am utterly dependent if something goes wrong there. And the multi-supplier ones are things where I can kind of move things around. And then that dotted line is dependencies. Now this is a real supply chain map. It's just part of it because we've done the same thing for see those little buildings on the map? So this is for a client of mine. This is all the place where they have hubs. And what we've been doing is mapping every single hub and its reach because the hubs all interact differently with the rest of the supply chain. And then there's a whole other overlay that shows the relationships between the hubs themselves. So I'm just showing you one view of this. But what we did was we said, okay, behind those lines is information about what those raw materials are, what those products are, what those processes are. So we reach out from the hub, the manufacturing point. The hub in your case is probably your office. And we say, who do I buy from? Where do they buy from? How dependent am I on those things? How does one piece of my supply chain relate to another piece of my supply chain? Are there dependencies? And you just keep drawing out the information until you have a sense of all of the different connections of supply to you. That's how you start mapping resilient supply chains. So we could see, I mean, if you look at that dark red line that goes out to the right, when you zoom in on this map, it actually shows about 8 different lines going into China. All of them, like half of them were dark red, half of them were light red. And then there were several raw material supply chains there in China. And then there were dependencies between all of them. And when COVID-19 hit, we knew we just lost that whole section of our supply chain. So that was how we started quickly moving things around the world to try to stay in business. By having them, if we had not had these maps when COVID-19 shutdown started, and in fact, we were looking at these maps in January because that's when the problems started in China, or at least we became aware of them in China. If we hadn't had these maps, we wouldn't have been able to picture where the problems were going to be next or how we might respond to the problems next. So what you're looking at is a very simplified view of a resilient supply chain map, but I think it's enough for you guys to get the idea of how to start thinking about your supply chain and the main elements you need to map it properly. Now let's talk about mapping for a responsible supply chain because that looks a little different. It actually looks pretty mind mappy when I first start mapping for a responsible supply chain. So we start with talking about our company and then we say, okay, what are the supplies? Well, I have gem dealers and I have metal dealers and I have, I forget what I put on this thing because I was like already yesterday and I don't remember yesterday, my consumables and then my tools and equipment. So, and probably chemicals I put on here too. So these are all the different things that would be in my supply chain. Then from there, and so Ani, to your question about a mind map, this took, I mean, you're seeing how fast I was able to create this when I wanted to create the example. So now for my gem dealers, I start thinking, okay, who are my gem suppliers? and I start mapping that out. I've got 3 or 4 different gem suppliers in this example that I rely on. And then from there, I start thinking about, okay, what products do I get from each supplier? So then maybe there's a product list on the side, and I think, okay, I get, these 10 different types of gem material. That's what I work with in my business. So here's my product list. And I get, you know, these 2 types of gems from supplier A and these 2 types of gems from supplier B. And then I sort of assign them to each of my suppliers. And then I say, well, who do they get the gems from? If I'm not dealing with the mine, they're getting them from somewhere. Where are they getting them from? Do I know where they're getting them from? In some cases, I might have a really clear answer. And in other cases, I might have a big question mark. So this is how you start creating transparent supply chains and showing I have questions. If you don't ever get it on a piece of paper and map it out, you don't know what your next set of questions needs to be. The mapping software, hi Sara. It's late in the evening for my friends from Italy, or it's getting there. Uh, this particular mapping software that I'm using is Lucidchart, but I actually tend to prefer Simple Mind for mind mapping, and I'll share more about that with you later. So that is how you would start mapping out a responsible supply chain map, and then you take all of your question marks and you know where you need to go digging for answers. And if your customers want to know, hey, where does your stuff come from? You can pull out your map and you can show them. I have answers to this, this, and this. I have assurance on these things, or I don't. But it starts making your business behaviors more transparent the moment you create the map. Okay, so tools for supply chain mapping. Supply chain maps have been around for centuries. I've seen some brilliant, beautifully painted supply chain maps from the 17 and 1800s, from seafaring supply chain explorers in Europe. But until very recently, a supply chain map could only provide a sort of summary or static view. In fact, the first online supply chain mapping software was only developed in 2008 at MIT. So for those of us who've been mapping for a long time, 2008 was really exciting because suddenly we had new tools to work with. And now we have a lot of tools to help us better map supply chain networks. Supply chain mapping and supply chain networks, you can improve your supply chain mapping with a couple of really cool things, thought processes, networks. So they're so complex that, first of all, we rely on social networks a lot to get a better handle on our supply chains. So you can collaborate at this really vast scale now. So teams can work together from all of the companies in a supply chain to account for materials and processes and shipments. We can communicate not just in email, which tends to be a rather pallid form of true collaboration, but through crowdsourcing and team software. And these things are inexpensive and easy to use, and they can be used on a mobile device. And there can be a ledger of a discussion around a product. So we use social networks to do a lot of our supply chain tracing. We can also use new forms of verification. So before online mapping, it was impossible to verify an address without visiting it in person. Now we can use GPS and satellite imagery to map every mine, every farm, every factory, every distribution center. Up until I got stuck at home for the last few months, I travel all over the world. And everywhere I go, whether it's in Africa or Europe or Asia, I pull out Google Maps and I just have it take me where I need to go. GPS allows us to see all of the world in an incredibly effective way. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than we had before, 2000. So instead of just monitoring supply chains with third-party auditors, which is ideal, we can also monitor them with a lot of electronic devices, and then we can communicate directly with factory managers and auditors and people in the field. We can also use metadata from digital images and other digital tools to help us with our mapping. And then we can also use real-time data. Now, until very recently, Only large companies could track and trace all their supplies, so think Walmart. And supply chain management software was notoriously inflexible. But Web 2.0 was built on something called APIs, Application Program Interfaces, meaning that modern websites and modern apps can all read and write from each other. So supply chain mapping today with an API means that we can synchronize data from a lot of different people. So we've got access to these large social networks, lots of electronic verification, and real time data. Again, none of those things make your supply chain fully verified or fully transparent, but they are all important ways to improve your supply chain mapping for both resiliency and responsibility purposes. So that's a big thought process on tools for supply chain mapping. The other area I want to give you an example of today is marketing mapping, partly because it's one of the other really big needs being expressed in our industry right now. Well, okay, nobody's saying, oh, help me, I don't know how to do a marketing map. But they are saying, I can't figure out what it means to do email automation, or I understand what a drip campaign is, but I can't wrap my mind around how to get it started, or I want to do more sophisticated marketing, but I can't figure out what all these moving parts are. Well, all of those things are just different ways of saying, I need tools to take my marketing to the next level. And mapping is one of those tools. It helps you get the thinking done so you can execute the work better. So it's a great example of mapping because we need it right now. But it's also a great example of mapping because it shows you if I can use mapping to map my supply chains and I can use mapping to do my marketing, those are pretty different things. And yet it's perfectly applicable to both. Laura FreeMind is also a really good tool. I like SimpleMind because you can go back and forth between your computer and your phone with it. And when I want a mind map, I don't want to have to run to my computer. FreeMind didn't used to do that, though it may be able to do it now because they're all upgrading all the time. So let's talk about marketing mapping. Now, first let's talk about a global concept. There are all these global concepts in marketing, okay? And this is an example of a funnel. Um, it's an example of a global process that makes sense conceptually, but then people aren't sure what to do with it after you teach it. I presented this funnel in a webinar I did the other day for In-Store Magazine. And the first question people asked was, okay, that's cool, but how do I use it? So I turned the marketing funnel into a map. So now you can see that the global concept is in the middle, and then the mapping is the thought process on either side of the model that helps take this abstract idea of sales funnels and turns it into concrete things like what is the client doing in this moment and what could I do to help them in this moment. So this becomes your content map. So if I'm reaching out to people at the top of the funnel, the prospects, I'm going to be doing things that are entertaining and informative and providing answers because what they're doing at this part of the funnel is they're searching and exploring and they're not sure if I'm their seller yet. So that's how you take a global concept and turn it into a map. And that's just a simple word map. Here's another map. It's a little harder to read and it's a map I borrowed from another type of business, so it's not necessarily relevant, but the headlines are. So the headlines on this are, okay, where is this customer in the buyer's journey? I'll just define that real quick so you don't get hung up on it. The buyer's journey here, they've defined it as awareness stage, consideration stage, and decision stage. Well, if we go back here to the sales funnel, look, we've got an awareness stage, we've got the center part of it, which is let's see, what did he call it in his map? The consideration stage, that's evaluation and intent, and then the decision stage is purchase, and then loyalty. So we're talking about the same things, just using different words for it, like we're not supposed to, right? Okay, so the buyer's journey is here. Where is the person in the buyer's journey? Well, what am I going to do? Do I want to just do a social media post? Do I want to do a blog post, or do I want to make a hard offer? Am I trying to get this person to think about me right now or to buy? And then once I know the answer to that, well, what's the format? If I'm doing an offer, what's the format going to be? Is it a white paper? Is it a booklet on how to care for your jewelry? Is it a booklet on why responsible jewelry is going to make your heart feel good? What's the offer format? Because sometimes we're trying to get them to buy the product directly, and sometimes we're just getting them to commit to giving us an email address so I don't have to go find them through advertising again in the future. So the offer could be a variety of things. Or if it's content, what's my content type? Then what are the relevant terms I'm going to use? The search engine optimization words, or in this case, the words that relate to where this person is in the funnel. And then once I know what all the relevant terms are, what are the terms I'm going to use for my business, because my business is going to look different than the other businesses. And then finally, what is my content? That is a marketing map. Starbucks did something very similar when they were redesigning their stores in 2010. They actually thought through, what's the customer doing when they're thinking about coming in for a cup of coffee? And then what happens when they first walk in? And now, what are all the different ways they engage with our brand when they're in the store? And then what happens when they leave? Because I want them to come back. And what is their reflection on the whole experience? That's a marketing map. And then that helps you decide what things you can do to market more effectively to those customers. Here's how you can take that marketing map and turn it into an email flowchart. So here's a drip campaign. So I send out an offer email. That's number one, week one. Some people don't open it. Some people open it but don't click on anything. Some people click on it but don't buy anything. Some people click on it and purchase, and some people complain. There's a whole world of email marketing. What do I do next? Because something has to happen next. And ideally, it's automated because you don't have time for this. You want to think about this whole campaign at the front, and then you want to go do other things like make great jewelry or work with your vendors or talk to your customers. You don't need to be doing this every single day. You want to do this in one big shot up front. So this map shows you that I need 7 different emails. I need a send, a non-open, a no-click, and no shopping. These are the emails I send to people who each fit one of those boxes. I need a survey email at the end, a thank you email at the end, and I'm sorry you left email at the end. And once you map that whole thing out, you can write those 7 emails. You can put them on a timer using any significant CRM or the expensive packages in MailChimp and Constant Contact. Almost everybody can give you some email automation, but that's how you prepare it. That's how you think it through. So you know what emails you need to write at the outset and how much time you're going to leave between them. So tools, you were asking about tools. My favorite mind mapping software is Simple Mind. And as I said before, it's because I love to be able to go back and forth. If I want to grab my phone and map a thought process real quick while I'm thinking about it, I want it to be easy to do. So Simple Mind works great on the phone. Other mind mapping software do too. They all cost around the same amount of money. So, and by the way, when I map it on my phone, later when I get to my desk, I want to open the same map and keep working on it. So it's that interaction between computer and phone that I think you're going to want. So make sure you get that. Lucidchart is my favorite mapping software for people who are not engineers. Now, there are some mapping programs we use that are much more complex. Most people don't need that complexity, and Lucidchart is really affordable. So I want to remind you one last time. First, you solve the process, then you solve the people. If you can figure out where your process problems, and that applies to yourself, by the way. If you've ever been really hard on yourself for making a mistake and you don't know why you made it, chances are you were following the wrong process, or you missed a process step, or you didn't even know there was a process you were supposed to be doing in a particular way. And that also applies to your employees, your coworkers, the people in your supply chain. People make mistakes all the time. It's human, but many times, most of the time, those mistakes can be avoided with some good process thinking, because people don't want to make mistakes and they feel bad when they do it. So that's the presentation on mapping. And now I'm going to just change this little presentation environment and come back to you and answer questions. So what kinds of questions do you guys have for me? Let's see. I see that. Okay, so Christina is asking, should I ask my vendors for permission before disclosing their names on my website? I don't think you have to. I think it's appropriate to just say, I'd like to disclose that you're part of my supply chain. Um, it's funny, the jewelry industry struggles with transparency, and everybody thinks that keeping my suppliers as secret is the key to my competitiveness. And if that's what you're holding on to for competitiveness right now, you're going to be out of business in no time because the internet has blown secrets out of the water. So my advice is to figure out something more important to be competitive with, and that's the answer to your three questions. Who am I? What do I do that makes me different? And why do I matter? If you've got that answer down, then you can be competitive and still disclose all of your competitors, because just because somebody knows where you buy something from doesn't mean they can steal your secret sauce. So I am a big fan of being as transparent as possible, but I also like to maintain really good relationships with vendors and have discussions with them because they may have a concern that I didn't even think about. Um, Now, Christina, if I have a vendor who doesn't want their name disclosed, I would ask them why. For my own sake, I would want to know, why don't you want your name disclosed? It may be a really good reason. It could also be a less good reason, so it's always worth asking. Let's see. What other questions do you guys have? Yeah, what are they hiding, Michael? That's what I was thinking. Repeat the thing. Okay, so Sandrine, these three, that's what I call the three questions, and they are the heart of strategy. So strategy is about differentiation and competitive advantage. And you could like do a whole MBA program on this, or you could just answer these three simple questions. Who am I? What do I do that makes me different? And why do I matter? If you can answer those three questions relative to your target customer, you can be very competitive. How do you communicate your supply chain to your customer? That's a very individual answer, I guess. Some companies literally publish their supply chains on their websites. They say, this is our supply chain. These are all our supply partners. Other companies share it on a one-by-one basis with their customers, or it's available upon request. I have been known to take out my process maps and just show people where things come from. I'm very comfortable with that. Um, but it there's no right or wrong way to do it. What's important is that you know who's in your supply chain, and that if it's important to your customers, you need to be able to provide it to them, or they're not going to be your customers. They'll go to somebody who can. Let's see, looking for other questions here. Any other questions, guys? Let's see. Oh, one question was, will you have a PDF? You will have a PDF of the slides. You will also have the full replay. So you'll have all of this. I'm thinking that I've answered all your questions. Unless somebody has another one, I'll hold on for just another minute. You're welcome, Scott. All right, so if we have exhausted all your questions, you guys can always get a hold of me. It's Andrea@strategyworks.com. That's strategy, WERX. I'm happy to answer questions. Oh, Michael wants to know, when would it be appropriate to include others in the chain? Michael, can you clarify that? Do you mean in terms of doing your supply chain mapping? Thanks, Christina. You have a good weekend too, John. You don't have to start the process alone. You can start it as a group. As long as you do the process. I tend to involve more people than not, because I think that you get a lot more good minds on the process, and people ask questions we don't think of asking ourselves. So I'm a big fan of doing these processes in groups, but you can also start it alone and then incorporate people. You're never going to finish a supply chain process alone. So if you're going to bring in your partners, and sooner rather than later is what I think is more effective. That's sort of an individual choice. Okay, so time to wrap up for today. Like I said, if you have another question, I'll be glad to answer it later offline. Um, Thank you to MJSA. I just love that you're so dedicated to industry knowledge, and that you've made this series free for the whole industry since the COVID crisis began. We are going to continue to do weekly free to the industry sessions all the way through June. We have a lot of exciting content coming up. So you can find that information at mjsa.org. And then there's a page just for webinars under events, I think. I think that's the name of the tab. So go check out the next events. We have 2 of them coming to you next week. We actually have one on Tuesday, which is going to be about the future of retail. I have some really exciting guests that are going to be on that call with me. David Kepron, who wrote the Retail Revolution, and he just approaches retail in the coolest way. And also Pam Levine, Marla Aaron's going to join me for that one, and somebody from PAC Team who's been at the forefront of figuring out how to make retail work during the COVID crisis and beyond. So that's Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern. And then on Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern, we're having a session on money. It's called Let's Talk About Money, and we're going to have some people who are experts in money for the jewelry industry talking to you about cash flow and risk planning and all the things that business owners need to know right now. And then, like I said, we're going all the way through to the end of June with a weekly webinar. So don't miss this hour. Next week, Tuesday and Thursday, every week thereafter, just on Thursday at 1 p.m. Again, thank you to MJSA. You guys are my favorite. And I will see all you guys later. Have a good rest of the day and a good weekend. Bye.